This conversation series was developed as a means for the Sustainability Lab to contribute to the urgent need to develop new models and approaches to addressing the interrelated sustainability crises affecting the world today. An archive of the conversations with some of the world's leading sustainability pioneers can be found on the lab's website. Tonight, we're going to focus on financing the challenge of averting the worst climate change scenarios, and we're so delighted to welcome Jason Parry, joining us this evening from Tokyo. Good morning, Jason.
Good morning. Yeah, pleasure to be here.
So I'll just tell you a little bit about Jason. Jason Parry works as a senior content R&D at Sapienship, a multidisciplinary organization advocating for global responsibility. Sapienship's mission is to clarify the global conversation, focus attention on the most important challenges, and support the quest for solutions. Jason is an academic with a PhD in comparative literature. Before joining Sapienship, he taught at universities in the USA. He has published essays in multiple fields, including philosophy, architectural theory, and ecology. Now I'm going to be turning things over to the founding director of the lab, Dr. Michael Ben-Eli. Hi, Michael.
Hello, Liz. Thank you. Welcome, and thank you, everyone, for being with us. And of course, welcome and thank you, Jason, for joining us tonight. We are really eager to learn more about the fascinating research that you have been involved with. It's really been a very encouraging perspective and perhaps a first ray of light in all the negative news concerning climate change.
Yeah, hi, everyone. Thanks very much, Michael, for the invitation. It's been really lovely learning more about the Sustainability Lab and the different projects that you're all engaged in. And I must say, actually, I know that there's a connection to Buckminster Fuller with the Sustainability Lab. And I will say that, you know, the name of this company, Sapienship, I didn't realize this when I first joined, but, you know, it actually refers to this idea that, you know, the Earth is like a spaceship on which we're all kind of having to get on together. And of course, I know Buckminster Fuller was an advocate of this idea as well. So there's actually kind of some interesting affinities, you know, philosophically here. So yeah, my name is Jason Parry. I'm a content R&D at Sapienship and an academic. I'm also at the moment a visiting research fellow at the Research Institute for Humanity and Nature in Kyoto. So I'm talking to you from Japan at the moment. And I suppose if I had to kind of give a general introduction to myself, I wouldn't focus so much on biographical information, but rather on two convictions that have kind of steered me, I think, to where I am today. And the first is this idea that curiosity is an incredibly precious resource, one that I think is all too often squandered. And, you know, I'm not really into mysticism, really, but there is something I think quite uncanny about curiosity and the way in which it functions, right? When you think about it, you encounter all these things in the course of a day, and then something kind of jumps out at you, and there's this kind of tug. And I don't know if we'll ever be able to develop instruments to measure this tug, but it's real, right? We can kind of feel it. And so one thing I found is that curiosity, you know, following curiosity, wherever it leads, often pays dividends in quite surprising ways. And I'm not sure why it works, but it's often the case that when something, you know, piques my curiosity and I look into it, I'll often find several weeks later that, you know, that thing ends up being quite influential in a way that at the time I could never have foreseen. And so I don't know what it is. It's like a kind of sublinguistic form of intelligence. I don't know how else to describe it. But, you know, I think that following curiosity is underrated. And the other thing is that, you know, I could kind of characterize my academic background as a kind of war against specialization, I think. You know, I think being a generalist is somewhat underrated. And, you know, of course, we need specialists, but I think we also need people who are able to spot, you know, these patterns and trends across fields of knowledge that I think other people miss. And I think that this is a skill that you can actually develop. And I think it's an important skill. And unfortunately, I think it is a skill that our current education system is not at all equipped to prepare. So, as an undergraduate, I went to a college that specialized in engineering, but I went to study art, and there were so few of us that they kind of lumped us all together, and that meant I was able to study music theory and acting and art history kind of all at the same time. So that ended up being a really good foundation. And then I went into comparative literature, which most people don't even know what that is. And the upside of that is that it gave me a lot of flexibility. So I was able to study things like ancient Greek and complex system science, and say I was doing comparative literature, and no one really batted an eyebrow. So I became an academic, and I was teaching at Purdue University for many years, which was really lovely. And I was at one point teaching about 150 students a semester. But when the opportunity to join Sapienship came along, I realized that I could, have access to an audience vastly larger than that. And this would be an opportunity to communicate ideas to really, significant numbers of people. And so I started out, I was doing research tasks for Yuval Harari, and eventually started doing lots of projects for the Sapienship team. And so that's where I am today.
Well, maybe you can tell us on your trajectory, maybe you can emphasize a few kind of important milestones and inspirational shaping moments and major roles of mentors and others, just to the key factors that brought you to where you are today. The making of Jason Parry.
Sure.
And then we'll move to.
Yeah, I remember walking into, an advanced philosophy class, and the professor's name was Charles Bumbach. I still remember him to this day. And we spent 3 hours looking at one page of text. And I realized that this was a level of reading that I had never thought possible, that it was, and in a way I felt that I had learned what reading meant on that day. And it was this feeling, maybe other people have felt something similar, as if I'd been given a kind of set of X-ray goggles. And so I could kind of see more of what was going on in the world. And so I will say that I think there are a few other people who have given me a similar sort of feeling. I remember cracking open a book, again, I picked it off the shelf on a whim, this mysterious curiosity at work by a philosopher named Manuel de Landa. And I had a very flashy cover, and it was called 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History, which I thought was a brilliant title. And, I cracked it open, and I realized that here was someone who was truly an intellectual omnivore, right? I mean, in the first several pages, he talks about the development of skeletal systems. He talks about ancient nomadic armies. He talks about the, Silicon Valley and the relationship to the Renaissance city-states. And I found out that he was teaching a course at the University of Pennsylvania. So every week I drove several hours to Philadelphia to attend his lectures. And he was very, very nice and would sit down with me and kind of go over things. And so, in a way, that is the feeling I think that I've been chasing, is this feeling that you have when you encounter another mind that gives you the sense of having X-ray goggles and being able to see kind of things that were totally invisible to you before.
So tell us a little bit about Sapienship itself, the organization that you are working with. What's its mission, how large it is, how it's organized, how many people, what kind of research, what kind of projects you are involved with, and so on. Also, how does it relate to the work of Yuval Harari? And since some of our audience may not really know much about Yuval Harari, perhaps you can say a few words about him as an introduction to Sapiens.
Sure. So Sapienship is a company. It was founded in 2019 by Yuval Harari and Itzik Yahav, and we're led by our CEO, Nama Avital. And so Yuval Harari is the author of Sapiens and Homo Deus and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. For years has been talking about the need for global collaboration to deal with some of humanity's most pressing issues. And the issues that he's particularly concerned about are those arising from technological disruption, those arising from ecological collapse, and also the prospect, which this year has been, I think, particularly acute, of global war, and what we might do to avert that. And so Sapienship was founded as a means of kind of focusing the global conversation around these issues and also pointing the way towards potential solutions. So there's 15 of us at Sapienship, including several academics like myself coming from a variety of fields. And we have quite a few projects in the works. There's a children's book series and a graphic novel series. There's also a television series in development and a series of immersive exhibitions. And also, and your audience may be interested in this, we're also launching some media channels. So you can find Sapienship on Instagram and on Facebook. And we're going to be launching lots of content on these channels that kind of is informative and educational, and should kind of, provide clarifying messages about these global problems. And finally, the thing that I think we're going to talk about today is we're also, embarking on some large-scale research projects and social media campaigns, of which the kind of the first one was this 2% more campaign, in which we're trying to encourage global leaders to invest 2% of global GDP to avert the worst climate change scenarios.
Well, the 2% more, of course, is our topic for tonight. As you say, the need to increase investment by only 2% of global gross domestic product in order to avert some of the most adverse impacts of climate change. So how did this notion came about? How did the idea come about? What's behind it? Tell us more about how this 2% emerged into consciousness.
Sure. So obviously, climate change is this major issue, and it touches every aspect of our lives. There's no industry that'll remain unaffected. There's no nation that'll remain unaffected. But what often remains unclear, I think, is the exact scale of the problem. For me, and I think for many people, it can at times seem completely overwhelming and just too incredibly complex. And it is very complex. But Yuval came up with this idea that if we could find out what exactly prominent organizations were saying the cost was, then that might make the problem appear more tractable. The idea was that we would survey the literature, find out what experts were saying, how many resources would it require to address this problem. And then, once we had narrowed that down to a number, we could build a campaign around that number. And the idea was that maybe this would, provide a sense of hope that is often, I think, kind of missing from the conversation around climate change, which, has kind of made this veer from denial of the significance of the problem to resignation that the problem is too immense. And so in a way, I think this campaign and this whole project was meant to provide the sense of, what really would we have to do? Because, all too often that kind of clarity has been lacking, I think, from the conversation.
So of course, one of the things that I've seen you emphasize in your research is the idea that 2% has to be invested in the right place. And if I read it correctly, the emphasis has been investment in energy-related technology, new forms of producing energy, transportation, things of that nature. Is that the case?
Right. So, I'm happy to kind of go into the details of, what resources we used to get to this number, and also talk about the limitations of these forecasts as well. So typically, these models and these forecasts are about the costs of limiting carbon emissions. which makes sense because, as opposed to other greenhouse gases, carbon can linger in the atmosphere for 1,000 years or more. Something like methane stays in the atmosphere for about 14 years. Nitrous oxide, I think it's about a century that it stays in the atmosphere. So these are really about the cost of mitigating carbon emissions. And the vast majority of carbon emissions come from things like power generation, transport, and various industrial processes. So most of the cost of the estimates is associated with developing new infrastructures, right, in those particular sectors. And comparing these models, one thing that made them fairly easy was that they generally had a common aim, which was finding out the cost of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. And so this was kind of helpful insofar as there was a kind of a common benchmark that these different organizations were using. But there were also some significant difficulties that I think it's worth getting into. Namely, the first difficulty was that a lot of these organizations, they do these calculations in different ways, and there's different assumptions built into their models. So, for example, some of these models will factor in the savings from climate disasters that don't happen, while other models won't. Some models will factor in behavioral changes that people make that limit emissions, whereas other models rely on negative emissions technologies, which generally make them more expensive. And also, a lot of the time we're talking about these numbers as a percentage of global GDP. And obviously, global GDP isn't like something like the gravitational constant, which stays constant. It's a fluctuating number. So, I'll also say that when I talk about these numbers as a percentage of GDP, I'm talking about global GDP in 2020, just because at the time when we were doing this work, those were the most recent numbers kind of available. And the second problem has to do with the fact that when you look at climate change, there's obviously a lot of competing interests in place. And when you look at the organizations that are publishing these forecasts, they take many different forms. There are forecasts and estimates published by energy companies, by NGOs, by think tanks, by government agencies, by academic institutions. And so, we not only had to look at the numbers themselves, but we also had to look at the organizations that were putting together the numbers. And so what we tried to do was really give priority to those forecasts that were made by organizations where climate scientists played a prominent role in the crafting of the forecast. And we also tried to prioritize those estimates where the data was transparent, where we could see what sources were being cited in the production of these estimates, which in some of these models that was impossible to do. And they were kind of a black box, you couldn't really go into them. And the last thing I'll say is that when we talk about net zero, obviously what we call the environmental crisis, carbon emissions is a big part of it, but it's not all of it, right? There's also things like the biodiversity crisis, which is a somewhat separate issue. There's various forms of pollution, which won't go away if we meet net zero, things like light pollution or noise pollution. And so, I'll also specify that, when I'm talking about these numbers, and when I'm talking about the 2% More campaign generally, I'm talking about the cost of mitigating carbon emissions, not necessarily solving every kind of environmental problem that we have. So with those caveats in mind, the report that we gave the most credence to was a 2018 report by the IPCC. And this received quite a lot of attention when it came out. And they're quite clear when you look at the numbers. They say that we're currently spending about $1 trillion on renewable energy and increasing the energy efficiency of buildings. But in order to keep global temperatures within a kind of safe space, we need to increase that to $2.5 trillion. So that's an increase of $1.5 trillion, which is just under 2% of global GDP. Also, we looked at a report by the International Energy Agency. And this is a organization that has many member states, and it provides policy advice to its member states. And in a 2021 report, they were quite clear that we're currently spending around 2.5% of global GDP on our energy system. But in order to get to net zero by 2050, they say this will have to increase to 4.5% of global GDP by 2030. And so here again, it's a difference of 2% of global GDP. And we also found a poll conducted by Reuters where they asked a bunch of climate economists, what they thought getting to net zero would cost. And, the answers clustered around 2% or 3% of global GDP. And so, this seemed like a good basis to start a campaign. And, I'll say that there were other models that said that it would cost less. I even found a model that said we would save money in the long run by getting to net zero. And there were also models that said it would cost, more, up to something like 9% of global GDP. But even looking at this distribution, it became clear that the cost of mitigating climate change was less than 10% of global GDP and was likely in the range of the low single digits of global GDP. And for us, this was just incredibly good news because suddenly the problem seemed tractable. And so, we thought this was a real reason for optimism.
Yeah, before we move forward, just to get the sense of proportion, what do you know? What is the current global GDP, and what would 2% be of that?
So when we ran these numbers, global GDP was around $96 trillion. And so, 2% of global GDP, we're talking about something like $1.8 trillion. Now, obviously, we were doing this in 2020, which was a very strange year for calculating GDP. So that number has changed since then. But so just to give you a sense, we're talking, 2% of global GDP is around, $1.8 trillion.
So to get it in the right proportion or the right context, how does that 2% relate to other major expenditure that we are quite used to or see over time?
Sure. I mean, if you go back in time, you can find lots of instances where governments mustered an equivalent or even greater level of resources to face some challenge. In fact, I just mentioned the pandemic, and in the first 9 months of 2020 alone, governments around the world mustered about 14% of global GDP to address the economic fallout of COVID-19, and that was obviously a massive and unexpected event. But going back even just a little bit further, if you look at something like the bank bailouts in 2008, 2009 during the financial crisis, Deborah Lucas is a professor of finance at MIT, and she has calculated that the US spent equivalent to 3.5% of its GDP in containing the fallout of that crisis. And, in that moment, obviously there was a decision made that certain financial institutions were too big to fail. That was the famous phrase. And in this sense, I think it stands to reason that perhaps the biosphere is also too big to fail and is deserving of a kind of similar amount of support. And finally, there's the case of war. One of the many tragic results of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the fact that money that could have gone to solar panels and wind turbines and things is most likely now going to go to fighter jets and tanks instead. Military spending is already something like 2.4% of global GDP, and is probably only going to increase for the next few years. But if you look at wars in the past, you find that faced with some kind of threat, states find gargantuan sums, to fund war efforts. In 1945 alone, the United States spent about 36% of its GDP winning World War II. So, we're talking about a tiny, tiny fraction of that, right, to make the planet habitable for future generations. And if we can only treat the risk, the threat of war. If we can treat climate change with a fraction of the same resources, we could resolve a lot of the problems. So it turns out that saving the planet isn't just better than destroying it. It's also a lot cheaper as well when you think about it.
And so I think everybody will ask the obvious question. I mean, where would we find the resources to find that energy transition? What kind of hidden pockets are there that we can pull the financing from?
Yeah, I mean, it's a common saying that when you find yourself in a hole, the first thing to do is to stop digging. And in this sense, I think one of the easy targets are fossil fuel subsidies. And what I'm talking about primarily are tax breaks and sometimes even direct payments to companies that artificially lower the price of extracting fossil fuels. And according to the IEA, these amount to something like $500 billion every year. So, obviously, cutting down on those would not only free up resources for other things, but it would also slow down emissions as well and accelerate the energy transition. Beyond that, I mean, there are some other possibilities as well. Something like tax evasion maybe deserves mention in this context. The EU has estimated that about 10% of the world's wealth is held in tax havens offshore. And the Tax Justice Network has estimated that over $400 billion is lost every year due to tax evasion. And that's about 0.5 percentage point of global GDP. So, just by clamping down on subsidies and clamping down on tax evasion, you're already generating massive amounts of resources that could play a significant role in decarbonization. And all it would take are a few well-designed policies.
There's obviously other things like food waste. And one thing that I wish you can touch on again before we move on is the subsidies to the oil and gas industry is only part of the real cost. All the externalities, all the impacts of those. I don't know if you can comment about that as a little bit as well, like health and so forth.
Sure. I mean, some economists at the IMF recently decided to take a more expansive definition of the word subsidy, and they included things like healthcare costs arising from air pollution, premature deaths arising from air pollution. And when you factor these things in, the total of these subsidies amounts to a truly eye-watering figure. It's something like 7% of global GDP. So clearly, I think there's space for, the nature of these costs is that they're shifted onto taxpayers, right? So people, pay through it, through their healthcare, et cetera. And so obviously there are kind of all sorts of second order benefits to decarbonization as well. It seems quite likely that not only will lots of people not die prematurely, but all kinds of mysterious illnesses may vanish. You'll probably see a rapid decrease in things like preterm births. And so, it will be an interesting experiment to see, how much of, sickness in the world was merely a product of this kind of energy system that we were kind of artificially prolonging.
Is there anything we can learn from history that help us kind of better understand and see the scope of this energy transformation that we need?
So, I mean, this won't be the first energy transition that humanity has been through. We've been through several. And, I think perhaps one of the most interesting ones and perhaps the most consequential one in history was the transition from wood being a primary fuel source to coal being a primary fuel source. Mm-hmm. If you look at history, the presence of wood was really a determining factor in the size of human settlements. A city would often require something like 50 times its size, an area equivalent to 50 times its size worth of wood in order to sustain itself on an annual basis. Wood was used for everything. I mean, cooking, heating, building, everything. It was a world of wood, right? And the fascinating thing is that this was the case for around 1 million years. Actually, there was a paper published just this week showing evidence of cooking about 800,000 years ago. And so, it's amazing to think that until about 150,000 years ago, 150 years ago, from 1 million years ago to 150 years ago, wood was the primary fuel source. And then we switched to coal. And the nature of that transition is interesting as well, because coal started being used in the early 16th century, but it didn't become the world's primary fuel source until the very end of the 19th century. So that's a 4-century lag, right? That whole process took 4 centuries to complete. And in a way, I mean, that could make you feel pessimistic about the speed of the energy transition, right? If it took 4 centuries, we don't seem to have 4 centuries to figure this out. But happily, I think there are some major differences this time around. Unlike in the 19th century, today we have these international organizations that are coordinating the energy transition. We may hope that they work slightly faster, but the fact that they exist is a major improvement over earlier eras. There's also a groundswell of popular support for this energy transition, right? There was you didn't have school children in 18th century Britain protesting, saying they wouldn't go to school until there was more coal being used. But we do have such a movement today. And finally, right, we have these rigorous empirical roadmaps, spelling out how much infrastructure we need to build, what kind of infrastructure we need to build, and how much it'll all cost. And so, all these things together show that, there's no reason to suspect that the energy transition before us should follow this kind of protracted timeline. And there's all this talk about climate tipping points, which is very alarming. These critical thresholds in the Earth system, which once they're crossed, they set off a kind of chain reaction. Things like the Eastern Antarctic ice sheet. If that collapses, that can set off a series of very unfortunate events. But it's also worth thinking about tipping points in the context of an energy transition. Right. There are tipping points about the price of renewable energy. There are tipping points of mass adoption when things really start to speed up. And so in a way, I think we're kind of in a race to see which set of tipping points we set off first. Right. Are we going to set off the tipping points of the accelerated timeline of the energy transition? Or are we going to set off the tipping points that send us to what scientists are calling hothouse Earth? Which sounds like a very unappealing place indeed. So, in many ways, that's the choice that we're facing.
And that's a nice and positive way to put it. Just last week at COP27, the Climate Change Convention in Sharm el-Sheikh, the United Nations Secretary General said, and I quote here, "The good news is that we know what to do, and we have the financial and technological resources to do it." So with that kind of as a background, I know that you mentioned that Sapienship is very much involved in advocating for global cooperation. And is there anything we can learn from previous instances of major cooperation of nations coming together in order to avert something that loomed dangerous?
Sure. I mean, there was a wonderful article published a few weeks ago in The Atlantic, and the headline was something like, "The US just passed a major climate treaty and no one noticed." And the article was about the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. And many people in the audience are probably familiar that the Montreal Protocol was the treaty leading to the phase out of chemicals that were responsible for destroying the ozone layer. And the amazing thing about the Kigali Amendment was an updated version of the Montreal Protocol, meant to kind of strengthen its regulations. And the amazing thing about the fact that it passed was the fact that it did so in a bipartisan manner, right? Something like 20 Republican senators voted in favor of it. And it was relatively uncontroversial. There was very little media attention paid to it. And the reason why the Montreal Protocol is somewhat interesting is that because it regulated these chemicals that were destroying the ozone layer, and because the ozone layer affects how much radiation reaches Earth, and because the amount of radiation hitting Earth affects plant growth, there are now billions of tons of carbon stored in plants that otherwise, in the absence of the Montreal Protocol, would have been in the atmosphere. And some estimates say that the effect of the Montreal Protocol will be so great that it will make a difference of 1 degree centigrade by the end of the century. So the amazing thing is that we already have a very effective climate treaty on the books, but that wasn't really its primary function, right? That was a kind of side effect. And I do actually wonder if there's a strategic lesson to be had here. Maybe there's space for something like covert activism, which sounds a bit like an oxymoron, but could be something like pursuing a climate goal by, focusing on policy results that are, tangentially related. We were just talking about air pollution, and I can imagine a global, ambitious air pollution treaty, having lots of support, and it would have the very happy side effect of severely mitigating emissions, but that wouldn't be its primary function. So here too, I wonder if, like the Montreal Protocol, there might be space for campaigns that work to limit climate in various kind of indirect ways. But the key message though is that climate change isn't something that any single state can unilaterally solve. It will require people to work together, and it will require coordination. And so, even if these meetings don't seem so satisfactory, it's, as I said, a major boost from previous eras where, the energy transition was completely uncoordinated.
I think at this point, it would be very interesting to learn a little bit more about your own research. One thing that I found personally very intriguing, you wrote a lot about the role of ruins in encouraging biodiversity. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So this project started a few years ago when I began collecting articles about endangered species discovered living in ruins. This wasn't an isolated kind of event, and it wasn't isolated to any particular place in the world either. It seemed to be a kind of general trend. There are stories of very endangered tortoises living quite happily among Greek ruins. There are stories of the most threatened species of seagull taking up residence in a flooded office block in New Zealand. Also, disused bunkers around the world have become home to endangered bats. And in ruins in Honduras, scientists found lots of species that were previously thought to be extinct. And to me, this seemed quite interesting. And I was curious about, what is the ecological reason for this? And it turns out that ecologists actually have a word for these kinds of habitats. They call them mosaic habitats. And mosaic habitats refer to the fact that they concentrate a lot of different niches in a relatively confined space. So more and more different kinds of species can live closely together than is the case in the surrounding ecosystem. And it occurred to me that this was an opportunity actually to rethink the discipline of architecture itself, right? I mean, the discipline has done a lot of introspection about its own role in climate change, right? Its construction is also a major source of emissions. And, the lifespan of a typical building is a few decades generally. So many buildings will live most of their lives as ruins. And so it struck me that it seems entirely possible to reformulate the discipline of architecture so that we can have architects building the biodiversity hotspots of the future. At the moment, we're doing it accidentally. We build buildings and they just happen to be good homes for endangered species. But I see no reason why we couldn't do that intentionally. and think about the future non-human occupants of our buildings from the very start of the design process. And I quite like this idea that, the various abandoned villages that we're seeing in countries as far apart as Italy and also here in Japan could have a second life actually as wildlife sanctuaries. I find that a very beautiful vision actually.
I think that there is another topic that you wrote about that I thought was fascinating, and that the role of technology. For example, the whole idea of cyber technology, so-called, as an automated technology that would basically provide a more functional feedback loop between the data that we get about what's happening in the world and the actions that we take, and maybe be a way to go around government. So maybe you can enlighten us a little bit about that aspect as well.
So as you say, there is this glaring contradiction between the fact that we have these incredibly sophisticated instruments, from sensors and satellites and aerostats and ocean buoys that are providing this real-time data about the planet. And they give us a very kind of fine-grained view of ecological processes unfolding on a planetary scale. But on the other hand, we have this political apparatus and these institutions that are very, very slow to react to the data that is being provided. And so, there are lots of people who are experimenting with ways to kind of short circuit, create a kind of tighter feedback loop. And, there are people using drones to identify and kill invasive species. There are also, various kind of projects to integrate algorithms with ecosystems. So, for example, one of my favorite art projects is done by some artists in Berlin, and it's called Terra Zero. And basically what they did was they purchased a piece of forested land, and they signed ownership of this land over to an algorithm. And this algorithm had a kind of very specific brief. It was designed to kind of sell off small bits of timber from itself and use the funds to purchase adjacent forested areas. So it would maximize the number of trees under its control. And so the end result was a forest that owned itself. Mm. And, here you have the confluence of kind of two different trends. One is the fact that all around the world, we have examples of jurisdictions extending legal personhood to ecosystems, right? Whether it's lakes or mountains or rivers. And we also have this kind of these autonomous systems that are increasingly capable of acting without human oversight. And so, just using the example of Terra Zero, I think we can imagine a future ecosystem endowed with legal personhood and kind of given this kind of digital prosthesis that is able to kind of do things that typically are reserved for things like corporations, right? Which also have legal personhood, which means that we could have ecosystems donating to political campaigns, or suing chronic polluters for damages, starting petitions, these kinds of things. And if you look back a century ago, you'll find all these very prominent thinkers who speculated about how we would use technology to reshape the world to fit human needs. And I wonder if in the next century, we might actually use technology to find out what ecosystems want. Yeah. And the end result might be flourishing human societies in communication with flourishing ecosystems. And that's a future that I'm quite interested in exploring.
It's interesting because in recently there's been a lot of negative reaction to different concepts about eco-engineering, geoengineering, major kind of technology engineering thing that will be put in space to capture whatever. And I think that the stuff that you're talking about is very different in spirit. And it's really how to introduce a consciousness almost in the system itself, how to use smart technology, how to use those approaches. And I think it's a really beautiful way to think. And I hope that the young generation like yourself will lead us into that kind of promise in the future. but certainly the work that you are doing is a great contribution. Thank you again. It was really wonderful to have you. Thank you, everybody else, and we'll see you on the next chat.
Thank you, Michael.